go through and talk about our next presenter. I don't know if I've seen DavidTimm present yet, so I'm really excited and eager to see his presentation. David comes to us from Glendale, Arizona, where he's the city's he's our SharePoint expert. So definitely a very tough and well, I guess kind of a hard thing to do too, to be the resident expert for the city government. Let's see, there we go. David, so besides being the city's the SME for all things SharePoint, Dave's also developed a lot of Tableau reports for the city, business partners using SharePoint lists as the data source. So we're actually really lucky to have him here at TFF to present about using SharePoint lists and Tableau. I know coming from the federal government space, it's very prevalent to have SharePoint users, SharePoint usage. It's also really funny too to watch data architects talk about SharePoint and SharePoint usage. So I'm really excited to see this. David, are you on?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Excellent. Yeah, I can hear you. If you wouldn't mind turning on your video, I think we're set. And because I was going to ask if you were ready to go.
Yeah, I'm ready. I actually don't have a webcam on this PC, so I'll just share my screen if that's all right.
Let me go through and give you control there.
So, Caesar, as you mentioned, my name is DavidTimm. I'm an application analyst and the SharePoint admin for the City of Glendale. I'm a latecomer to Tableau. I resisted it at first because I didn't want to learn yet another reporting application. But once I dove into it, I drank the Kool-Aid and the bug bit me, and I've had a lot of good success with it as a whole, and I really love what it can do as an application and just its overall functionality. I'm also the SharePoint admin for the city. All things SharePoint come through me. And one of the things that SharePoint has always lacked, of course, is reporting. You had to export to Excel or import into Crystal or anything else to get any kind of reporting. With about version 10.5, I think, Tableau finally managed to make SharePoint and Tableau play nicely together. We use SharePoint 365 as opposed to on-premise, and they're two different animals, and we're going to focus on the 365 lists for now and go from there. Hopefully today I'll be able to demonstrate exactly how we use both SharePoint 365 and Tableau to do any kind of data collection and reporting and improve on old school techniques. I'm going to show you how we started with the department and a valid use case that got this ball up and rolling for us initially and has kept it going. SharePoint 365 does have some limitations. Depending on who you're talking to, you may hear SharePoint, UG, but it does work if you know what you're doing. And we'll discuss how to get around some of those. There's a couple things you need to know before you can connect Tableau to SharePoint 365. They are important and will bite you if you don't. I'll show you connecting to a SharePoint 365 site and then how to use that data once we get it and how to pull it into Tableau. So why SharePoint? Well, you can't have a viz without the data, and the data's got to be someplace. SharePoint brings a couple of benefits to the table. The lists will allow a user to collect, share, edit, and store the data in the SharePoint site itself. You don't need VPN or network connection. All they need to do is authenticate using any internet connection, Wi-Fi, and any device. It makes it pretty handy. SharePoint also allows us to control the access to the data and the data continuity using native SharePoint security groups, Active Directory groups that are tied into that. The data can be versioned, so we have a nice history in case anybody oopses anything, overwrites or deletes data. We know who can get in. We can track the data, what happens. And we can also use SharePoint workflows to provide some automation if we want to head down that path. I have worked lists that do use workflows, they're minimal because they can be fun as well. But ultimately, you're just filling a list with data. Using SharePoint is also pretty quick. Your SharePoint administrator can spin up a list and or a site, make a basic form, and have users entering data really pretty quickly. And it's a lot easier than trying to get a SQL server developed through a DBA and any random front end developed. So it's helpful. Now, there's always got to be a need to start this ball rolling. Users currently usually need to find out who is doing what, when, and where. And this particular project started when one of our bigger departments, Parks and Rec, came to me with their current process of tracking the tasks of their field staff, what they were doing, where they were doing it. They had heard about Tableau, seen some basic things in what we were doing. They knew about SharePoint as a concept, and they wanted to talk about improving their current process. We had a meeting, and they told me what their current process was. I actually said the last line, sorry, you're doing it how? Really? Well, it was all manual across the board. The parks maintenance staff, any given time, has about 30 to 35 field workers. Originally, those workers would fill out pieces of paper in their trucks or at picnic tables or wherever. They would manually enter all the data using pen and pencil. They'd manually drop off those papers to the main office on a semi-regularly schedule. The staff would have to manually translate 35 different handwriting styles and transcribe those into a simple spreadsheet. As you can imagine, not only was this very time-consuming and took a lot of effort, but it wasn't exactly very fun. Tended to result in a little Mad Max Fury Road Angry morale onto the staff. And it was shared among even managers and admins. It took them quite a bit of time because these things would accumulate. So we knew there had to be a better way. This is what the pieces of paper look like. So workers filled these out, one per day, turned them into the office. They tended to stack up. They tended to be hard to read. When you could read it, you had to type manually each line into a single spreadsheet that wasn't shared every week. And if you didn't get to it, everybody was turning stuff in, so the pile tended to grow over time. And it took a while to even get the information, much less doing reporting on it. And when they did enter it in, this was their root data source. Nice, ugly spreadsheet, one tab per week, I believe, which limited your time over time ability to collect data. And if someone actually deleted something, maybe you caught it, maybe you didn't. You had the hard copies to fall back on, but imagine this month after month being your raw data source. And even it was what they had is what they had, right? So they had to produce something. And we have pie charts. We all love pie charts. They work great. But this was all they had, a couple of data points for a specific data set. If they wanted to change it, they had to go back and recreate the whole thing. The Parks and Rec staff, they weren't exactly tech savvy, so there are ways to automate this to a degree. But it was built over time, and it was ugly, and they knew they had to do something. So enter SharePoint. We created the SharePoint Maintenance Unit Task Tracker, or MUT application. We sat and talked, and it's like, how about we use a web form to enter the data, and we put the list on a semi-private SharePoint 365 site, accessible only for our users. The workers can then access this from anywhere they have Wi-Fi or network connectivity, even from home, enter the data themselves as they understand it, and it would be live and we could record on it. At the time, this was also okay, exported to Excel and do your metrics there, but it was a short step next to improve on that. And yeah, we use an info path form, which is 2010 technology, but it got us away from paper. Wasn't a bad step one for gathering the data. Then we jumped to step two, which was making a phone app. The users didn't exactly like using a web form on their phones, even though you could. You had to pinch and drag and log in and type really tiny text. So we discovered Power Apps. Power Apps is an application that Microsoft developed in your Office 365 suite if you have the right license. It basically lets us make a quasi phone app that you can download onto your phone from the App Store, authenticate using your, in our case, city credentials, enter data and feed the SharePoint site live, and be faster, lightweight, and a lot easier to use. And went over pretty well. Now that we have an easy entry point, the data is collected and stored, security protected, versioned in SharePoint List itself, and entries are fed live. The paper went away accordingly, completely. And the users enter about 3,500 records a month into this on their own. And we have a solid time over time data set that we can use, stretching back pretty much a year and a half that this has been in, been in use by the staff. Once we have our data, we just use Tableau, we point to it and let it whiz away. This example that I developed first uses a combination of multiple SharePoint tables and an Esri shapefile to make the heat map. We have a nice little viz and tooltip in there whenever you hover over a selected park to give more data to show who's doing what and where. And this was actually one of the first big examples that I personally developed with help from a couple of our gurus here in-house. And that got showed to the executive staff who really liked it. Tableau was new to the city at the time, so this kind of gave them a flavor of what it was and drive home Tableau as a concept. And it got the departments interested and started to spread the word visually on what could be done. Basically, once you point SharePoint and Tableau together, you can do anything Tableau can do. This is just another dashboard we use that uses the same data set, but kind of gives us the top 10 to show where all of our efforts are being focused and who's doing what over time, and let it be dynamic so they can choose what periods you're looking at or go back the entire time set that they wanted to. So is SharePoint the answer? Yes and no. There are some things to be aware of when you want to use SharePoint as your basic data repository. You can't have a live data connection, at least not currently. You're using extracts only, which is fine as long as you plan it appropriately. Tableau, once you connect, gets its data from the list's default SharePoint view. If you know about SharePoint lists, you can have many different views that act as filters, but Tableau pulls the SharePoint data set from whatever is in the default view. So you kind of want to show everything in that default view. The SharePoint view in 365 has a limit of 5,000 records showing at any given time. This can be a problem if you have large data sets. Luckily, we can kind of ignore that or get around it when we use Tableau. One of the options is just to set a sort by ID and ignore the whole thing, or no sort at all. And then Tableau will grab everything that we see. And this is great. It lets Tableau see the full data set. But if you're using SharePoint to view the data, once you hit that 5,000 record limit, it tends to break it. But there are ways around that. But overall, this model was pretty well received. It was expanded to several other similar departments in a like type application. The parks and rangers developed their Ranger Activity Task Tracker, or the RAT, and our right-of-way team has developed the Activity Reporting for Right-of-Way, or the ARROW. And yeah, I got to name them, so that's what they get. It's been gone over pretty well, though. So the SharePoint 365 limit of 5,000. This one can show up after the fact, depending on how soon you connect versus rolling up an application. This one actually bit me just last week. I had a data source I was pointing to in SharePoint, a couple lists, that returned a failed extract one morning. This particular one was one of the first ones we developed. It had been humming along nicely for months and months and months. Then all of a sudden one morning, fail. Okay, well, this was city facing, so we had to get to that right away and find out why. Well, it turns out I had a sort on the fields. I had multiple sorts on the fields. And all of a sudden, I hit that 5,000 limit. And once that happens and you go back into SharePoint, you see this view up here that says the view cannot be displayed because it exceeds that limit. Okay, that's nice. I had other larger data sets that were doing that. So why? Digging in, multiple views. So I started stripping stuff away, and turns out that was a culprit. Once I fixed it, and you go into SharePoint, you see all the records by default. Although if you try and sort on them, SharePoint will tell you, sorry, there's a limit here. I can't do anything about it. And that's okay, because we're not using SharePoint to view, we're using Tableau. And that worked out fine. You just have to educate your users to say, don't go here, go to Tableau instead, use these dashboards for your reporting, and they'll be fine. So how do we do it? Well, you need access to the SharePoint site, farm, and list that you want to get the data from. You have to connect as a user. That user also has to have access in the SharePoint site. You ideally don't want to use your own account if you're going to publish something. You can, but if you win the lottery, abducted by aliens, hit by a beer truck, whatever, it's going to break when you leave the company. We had a specific account created just for this. That account is treated as a user in SharePoint, and we connect with that once we hit production. That way you eliminate any account lockouts, password changes, and it can keep on running even once you get promoted or move on. You also need to know how you're authenticating to SharePoint from a network perspective. Fun words like Kerberos, NTLM, third-party SSO, always kind of scary, could be confusing. When in doubt, talk to your network team. We're using third-party SSO, single sign-on, so that didn't require any other setup on our end, and it made life a lot easier. You need to install the SharePoint driver to your PC. Tableau does not come with this pre-configured. With any luck in the future, that might change. But in the meantime, it's an extra step. It was fun to discover that once this all came up, but once you figure out what it is, it's not that big of a deal. And a little initiative once you get started, and you'll be walking the path in no time. So once you first try to sign into SharePoint, you'll see here on the right, you put in all your information. The sign in button is grayed out, and we get the download all the drivers, link, which is handy. That actually links us back to tableau.com support and drivers. And you click on the download, and you get you to the CData SharePoint driver is what we're installing. And it actually, you have to go and it puts the download file on your desktop, usually in the downloads folder, and we go and run it, provided you have permission to install things on your desktop. Luckily, it's free, so no worries there. Installing it's easy. Once you get the package, you pretty much just do next times 8. You pause around number 5 to enter in your name and your email. Install it. At the very end, there's a checkbox that says Configure ODBC Data Source. Just uncheck it because you pretty much don't need it. Once we have all of our ducks in a row, the drivers are installed. We have to do that the very first time you do it. Open Tableau like you would for anything else. You choose SharePoint Lists from the server data source. A little box pops up. You populate it with the proper information, your SharePoint site, the root and the site name itself. We're SharePoint Online from the drop-down box. Our authentication was third-party single sign-on. The username and password that you want to connect as. Ideally, you want this to be the user you had created before. You can connect as yourself. I would assume you have access to the SharePoint site and lists, but you want to do what you're going to do in production. Just be careful if it does fail and your network has set up lockout account after 5 times, you won't have to go any further and you'll have to go back to your help desk and have that account unlocked. But hopefully you won't have that. The SSO domain was the same domain as you have up here usually. And you click sign in, and with any luck, it will connect, crank away for a few seconds, and then Tableau will show a normal screen. The lists that are within that site, every single one will show up as tables. You can drag 2 or more tables, lists, up into the tables area, connect them on a common field using normal joins, just like you would a SQL Server or any multiple data sets. They'll populate below. Tableau translates the data types relatively well. I mean, I haven't had any problems with them, the same as you have in SharePoint. Number, text, date, time, string, they're all there. Once you're in Tableau, you can create calculated fields, and they will all show in the list as well. And again, this is an extract of the data, so Tableau isn't really connected to SharePoint anymore at this time, which is great to eliminate any kind of network lag depending on where your SharePoint site is or your network connection. And it treats the information pretty much the same as everything else, any other normal data source. So when you use SharePoint, you have access to, okay, maybe not unlimited data, but you can spin up SharePoint lists pretty prolifically, and you get to any data in any SharePoint site that you have access to get to. One caveat is you cannot access lists across different sites. So this is a single site solution only. So plan that into your SharePoint design if you need to. But once you get there, you schedule your extracts as you needed on the server side, assuming you publish to a server. If it's on your desktop, you just do a manual extract when you open it up. Refresh the data source, and you're good to go. Here in the city, we do pretty much nightly refreshes, so we're running a day behind. We're not live per se. You could do it more frequently. I probably wouldn't recommend more than 3 or 4 times per day, but you're always open to experiment and see what happens. But getting live using this method probably isn't the best way to think about it. But try it and see what happens. That's pretty much it. Once you get the basics, it's not that difficult. You got to have permission to get to the site and the information. You need to have a user to connect it, to. That user must also have a SharePoint license. So if that's an issue that needs to be thought about, you add that user like any other SharePoint user into that site and list. Make sure that person can at least see the list, read permission or higher. Download and install the drivers, connect to server SharePoint, fill out the connection info with the username and password and the site you're getting to, drag the lists to the top, create any joins if you want to, and then go all Tableau on it. Make your worksheets and dashboards to wow your customers and your management. publish it to a server, embed the password in your connection so it can refresh on its own, set up a schedule, and you're good to go. Once it's on there, we've actually used the API to embed Tableau reports into our public website as well as into the SharePoint site itself to share the information in Tableau native. Not part of connecting to, but it's been handy. That being said, that's pretty much all I have.
Well, David, thank you so much for that. It was awesome. We've got a load of questions. Actually, I don't know if you've caught this on the chat. I don't know if you have, but
no, I was sorry.
There's been some awesome conversation. Josh Tapley, Michael Perillo, they've been kind of bouncing back and forth. And the best thing about the Tableau community is the Tableau community tends to help itself. There've been a lot of answers and questions. I think I saw the question earlier about your authentication type, and you did answer that, where it's a single sign-on third-party app.
Yeah, for us, a lot of that is the single sign-on is controlled by the network and whoever sets up the SharePoint 365 model as a whole. We were an early adopter of SharePoint 365 in the city, so we kind of built it as we went, stumbling over ourselves as we go. But that was what the network team luckily came up with. And it worked out well. So it makes life easier, and you can use your same credentials, and it works well.
There are more questions. It's actually this is great because I think you've kind of started a community within the community of SharePoint users. I see Kate Brown asking if you can share your slides, which is actually, it would be really helpful. And like I said, this is the best part of TFF is we come on and we kind of find other experts within these communities. Michael Perillo is asking if you have any options or solutions that have helped address sharing and connecting or joining data across sites.
I have not come across that. One of the things that I just use by default is one site per connection or per workbook, basically. We have 3 different sites in my world right now for those 3 apps, but they're all under the same tenant and the same farm. So if you have something in SharePoint.com/foo and SharePoint.com/bar, I'm not aware of a way to join those 2 together separately. You have to join them to a common place somewhere and then link to that.
Okay.
As far as sharing my deck, me being not a big Tableau guy, I will pass it on to my coworker at Local Jedi, who's also presenting later, Michael Sandberg. He's got a blog and a Twitter account and all the fun stuff. I will see if he can post it there and make it available for everybody to download. And I'm glad you want it. That's awesome.
Very cool. Yeah. It's great. You hit the nail on the head with these when you start getting so much community involvement and action. And there's a lot of great just chatter on the chat boards right now. I see one. This is an interesting one. Have you ever seen an instance where you can connect to SharePoint lists successfully, but no rows and columns show?
Usually, if you're not getting anything, you want to look at your default view. If you can go into SharePoint, your default view that you see on that list has data, you should be seeing that. If there's no data there, Tableau can't bring anything back. So start there first. But if it connects, that's where it's going. And if you connect successfully, then your connection has worked. Make sure the user you're connecting as is the same user you're viewing the SharePoint data as. And those 2 things, one of those should probably resolve the problem, I would imagine.
A very last point too is permissioning too. Sometimes there's some strange permissioning on SharePoint lists.
Especially when you just get started, exactly.
Yeah. So that's definitely a big one. Aki, I hope we answered your question there. But yeah, definitely a good number of steps to go through and just to troubleshoot some of these things.
Aside from that, I appreciate this opportunity. It's been, this is my first time in the TFF, and I thank Michael Sandberg for throwing this at me and making me do it. It's been fun. I'm glad I could help. SharePoint's a good resource, and I hope everybody can get something out of it, and go and have fun.
David, thank you so much for coming on. This is exactly why we do this. This is, it first gives people a chance to share their unique, the skills they have mastery of, that a lot of us may not have gotten to. We may not have an environment where we use SharePoint, but it's always kind of fun because you never know what's going to pop up in the future. We always, I know a lot of us get very weird questions and requests, but yeah, just coming on board and going through and sharing what you know. This is what the community is about.
And I will say that once we could connect to SharePoint, I believe it really did help drive Tableau in our organization, because that was a big need we had for reporting. And once Tableau is seen by the users, then it just spread from Parks and Rec to finance to every other department that we have, executive level on down, and it's taken off like wildfire. And like I said, I've drank the Kool-Aid and think it's an awesome application, and I hope it continues to develop.
Great. No, awesome. Thank you so much, David.
All right, thanks, Heather.
Yeah, we're right up on the hour. Wanted to welcome you if you're just joining us here at the Tableau Fringe Fest. You have, well, you haven't missed it all. We're actually doing really well. But we've had some great panels. We had the Women Plus Data panel, the governance panel, some amazing presenters. But we're about midway right now through, and it is it's a pleasure to be able to present our next speaker. Our next speaker is actually, it's funny because I've known him for very long. In my head, he's always just been the data Jedi ninja.